Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and on this installment of The Tone Engineer, we are chasing the legendary 90s metal tones from the boogie years of Meshuggah. Funny enough, today's video is actually the one that inspired this whole series because I definitely wanted to cover these Destroy, Erase, Improve, Chaos Sphere, None tones that I absolutely adore. Still among my favorite 7-string sounds of all time. But I've, kind of covered to death Meshuggah in terms of their more recent Line 6 or even real amplifier tones that you'll hear on the more recent album. And I said, let's just go ahead and combine it all. Let's do real amps, let's do VST plugins, let's take all of those ideas I've had in different series and just make it into one. So this is why we're doing this series at all. And today's setup is actually a kind of a cool one in terms of gear because we're actually not using a single, well, take that back. There is one piece of gear that we have in common, but neither of these amps, the cab, the guitar, one of the microphones, they're not at all what we're used on the album, but they're close enough. They're all within kind of the same family of gear, and they play well enough together that I think the end tone is remarkably close. So with that, let's talk about what we're trying to emulate and what we're using in place of each of those pieces of gear, starting with a guitar. From Contradictions Collapse up until they started experimenting with 8-string guitars, both Friedrich's and later Morton's main recording axes were the Ibanez UV7, which is Steve Vai's signature universe. I would love to have one of those things. They keep their value too well, unfortunately, and I would really not like to break the bank on that, but understandably so. This is the infamous green dot model with, the black paint scheme, green dot inlays, green pickups, and otherwise they were fairly stock. So I think both the guys had their pickups wax potted because they were using some insane gain levels and high stage volume. So feedback was legitimately an issue. And then I think he changed some knob colors or something at one point, but otherwise stock bolt-on 7-string Ibanez. So if you have any 7-string guitar that's in this case a standard scale length, 25.5 inches, you'll probably be able to get in a decent ballpark to these tones without much issue whatsoever, especially if you have passive pickups that are voiced this way. In my opinion, that is the biggest deal breaker. I've gotten close to these tones with the MGs and even Fishman Fluences. I prefer those, but I feel that the passives really are the magic ingredient when it comes to the guitar side of things for these kind of tones. You're going to be smashing the dynamics, and we'll have some tools in here that you can kind of compensate for those EQ differences, but DiMarzio, Seymour Duncan, whatever, they'll sound pretty good. In this case, I'm using something that resembles their newer guitars much more than the Universes. This is my NOF Custom Super Typhoon 8-string. This is a 28-inch scale guitar, so much longer than what they used on those albums, but this kind of mimics what they're playing these days. In terms of scale length that run between 27 and 29.4 inches. And of course, I'm using the lovely Lundgren M8 pickups, which Meshuggah also uses, and still my favorite 8-string pickups ever for high gain sounds. So if you like their live tones, if you like the way they're playing those songs today, there you go. This is about as close as you'll be able to get. The main feature here being, again, these passive pickups, which are voiced slightly differently than the DiMarzios, as you might expect for an 8-string, but they still handle the lower 2 or 3 strings more or less the same, especially by the time that you account for the scale length differences and string gauges and all that. This will work. So you've got some room to play with. It doesn't have to be a Ibanez. It doesn't even have to be a bolt-on, as you'll see. But all those things will help ultimately, but you'll still have some tools to account for those differences. I am, however, running the same string gauges they would have been. So this is 9 on the top, and then we got 52 on the low B flat string, which may be a little light for some people. When you stretch this out to 28 inches, it feels perfect, but you've got some leeway. You could probably, be fine up to 56, but don't go too thick. I do find that a lot of their cutting sound comes from those string gauges, not necessarily the tone, but just the feedback and being able to play that way. Then we get into the start of the signal chain. Here's where things get fun. For all 3 of today's discussed album tones, all the way up until they switch rigs entirely with the Line 6 Veta 2 heads, their signal chains begin with this little pedal called the TC Electronic Integrated Preamp, or for Friedrich, at least on one part of his signal chain, he would also use a similar pedal from TC called the Booster, Line Driver, and Distortion, which is essentially the same circuit, except you can blend in some dirt in there, and from what I can tell, they never use that anyway. But long story short, these are glorified EQ and boost pedals, and they do some very important things for this kind of signal chain. They got a bass, treble, and output control. The way the guys would set these up, at least according to pictures both past and present that I've seen of Friedrich's enormous collection of these things, is roll the bass pretty much all the way off to 0, keep treble near noon, and then adjust output to taste depending on how much boost you need. A lot of the times 0 would work because we're going through high gain amplifier heads. And what this does is cut off a lot of the low end that you're receiving from extended range guitars, which is extremely important when you're tuning down to B flat or especially F standard, because otherwise it's a muddy, inarticulate mess. This does a similar thing to what tube screamers do when you max the tone, except that's more of a, a big chunk out of the lower frequency spectrum and more of a, kind of a bump in the upper ones, where this is more or less just one of these and evens out the guitar sound, doesn't have that quacky, cocked wah nature that some people don't like. So that's more or less what you're trying to achieve with that stage of the signal chain. Unfortunately, these pedals were discontinued quite a while ago, and the ones that you might find on the used markets, well, they keep their value very well. And I can kind of understand why. It's a collector's item. They do some cool stuff in that they can handle up to like 24 volts, I think, on their input voltage. So that gives you more headroom and clarity when you're doing a lot of boosting. But it's not necessary for what we're trying to achieve here. You've got a few options in terms of replacements. Protone doesn't make a reproduction, same sort of Baxendal tone stack thing. You can buy, I think, in a PCB clone of this and make your own if you're into that. But the easiest thing, well, 2 easiest things in this case. First of all, we have the Friedrich Thorndahl Signature 33 from Fortin Amps. This would be the expensive route to go for. That is almost as bad, if not worse, than trying to get a TC boost on its own, because these things were discontinued as well, and they're selling for ridiculous prices. But this already has a baked-in clean boost curve that does a similar thing, rolls off on that 250 to 300 hertz region, gives you a bump in the higher frequencies, and I'll be using this primarily throughout the demos you'll hear today. It does have a bit more high frequency bite that I think is better suited for 8 strings and doesn't quite capture the same profile though you'll hear on some of the album tones, though it certainly works. So if you have this or Fortin Grind or any other contemporary overdrive pedal, boost pedal, say like the Aries Effects stuff or the Horizon Devices stuff, that'll work. What you're really trying to do is just tame that low end. The cheap thing you can do, the more versatile thing you can do, is something like this Boss GE7. Obviously, this has some drawbacks. It is more noisy compared to a lot of these solutions. I find the GE7 actually isn't that bad though, even when max level like this. But as you can see, the EQ curve doing pretty much the same thing. You're going to get some more ripple in this, where you're only attacking a few bands at a time, but it's pretty close. And for a couple of the snippets we'll be playing, I actually prefer this. Others, I prefer that. But you can tweak this to your guitar, which is a good thing. And even if you don't have the exact set of pickups, or they're not maybe scooped out enough, or whatever sound you're missing, you can compensate for it with this. No, Wampler makes a parametric EQ pedal. There's all kinds of different options, but basically what you want to do, roll off your low end, boost the input. Done. On to the amplifiers. The rhythm guitars for None were tracked through a Mesa Boogie 50 caliber plus, which has often been compared to the Mark series for having similar preamp controls as well as an active 5-band EQ in the post section. But it's a bit of a different beast. It kind of sounds halfway between a Mark series and even a little bit of rectifier in terms of its overall sound quality. It kind of has its own thing going on as well. But I don't have one of those. So picking the next best thing, arguably, I think it's a better amp, is the Mesa Mark IV. We're going to be using the red channel, which is the lead channel. I've got the post EQ like that, which is kind of a strange setting. Normally, you know, dipping the 750 hertz is pretty much bog standard for most metal tones, but quite a sizable chunk of 2200 has been taken out. 6600 is mostly flat and kind of a low shelf after 240. And of course, all of this is going to depend on your cabinet setup and mics and all that stuff. But None has a very hollow guitar tone, and I really dig it for especially 7 strings and really 6 strings. It's like a thrashy, halfway between Injustice for All and Master of Puppets sound. That I really like it. Being that this is a Mark series head, I've set the tone stack to give generous amounts of treble and mids at about 6.5 and 4.5 respectively. Enough bass to give the boost pedal something to cut, but not too much to counteract it. So we're sitting at about 2.5 there. About 8.5 on lead gain, about 8 on lead drive. Neither of these are pulled. Usually I like to pull fat for especially boosting this amp, but it doesn't need it. It has that hollowed out sound that I really like. Master volume's at 5. The higher you take it, I think it sounds really great on this. With presence, we're at about 6. And the output volume really isn't high enough to even matter if we're on full power at 85 watts or tweed power at 50, though that is a 50 watt amp if you want to, you know, be more realistic. But otherwise, I think this is a decent approximation. I like this amp better than all the 50 cal clips I've heard, but if you're going to go for that sound, then you'll be able to save some cash on that. Obviously, Friedrich also used that amp on practically all the leads during that era, as well as using it to track the rhythm guitars on his own special defects, which I think was mixed with the valve state. So overall, it's a great amp for Meshuggah for that era of metal. Down used them at one point. Alan Holdsworth, which is probably where Friedrich got that idea to begin with. So very versatile amp for that kind of stuff. Just don't expect it to do everything this does. For DEI and Chaosphere, though, both guitarists had switched over to the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, and this was the glorious 1990s era of revision Fs and Gs and the dual channels, and these are among my favorite amps ever. These were the tones that made me say, yeah, I gotta get me a rectifier at some point. These were supposedly recorded with the orange modern channel, and this is a classic trick, taking the orange channel, putting it in the high gain mode and boosting it with, say, a tube screamer. Lots of iconic rectifier tones were that combination. In this case, I can't mimic that because I don't have an orange channel. My rhythm channel doesn't do the high gain thing because I'm using a Series 1 single rectifier, so 50 watts. You don't have the option for the tube-driven rectification, which I'm pretty sure they were using solid state anyway. Not going to be the biggest deal in the world, no matter which setting you have it on. Definitely experiment. And also experiment with the channels, because for at least the Fractal patches I ended up making, one of the sounds, I liked it better on the orange channel. One of the sounds, I liked it better on the red channel. So it's not going to be the biggest deal in the world. I find that the red channel does have a little more saturation in the low end, more thump that I liked for one album. And then the orange channel is kind of flatter and gives you a better bass for boosting. But either way, it's going to sound more or less identical. I doubt that if you change them in the middle of a set, most people would even notice. But by the time you make your own tweaks to the tone stack and gain controls, it really isn't going to be a deal breaker. You'll be able to make them sound more or less the same, especially when you throw them in the mix with the bass and drums and all that. So for my settings, I've got the master volume at about 9 o'clock. because the output volume is barely on. It's a loud amp. The presence is similarly a little past 9 because I've got it on the modern mode, which automatically adds a presence boost. So if you used vintage, you'll want that higher. We've got the bass at about 1 o'clock, 1:30. This is one people miss a lot with the mids. I've got this all the way to 3 o'clock. And this does a cool thing on rectifiers. People are always like, yeah, crank, we got to scoop the mids because it's a Mesa amp. No, try that. It actually sounds really great. It's not the traditional mid frequency either, where these tone stack controls kind of feed each other. It's a very different sound and just adds some great guitar frequency saturation. For treble, similarly, we've got this one actually kind of tamed at less than 1 o'clock, so anywhere between noon and there works pretty well. This does a similar thing where it more or less just changes the voicing of the amp. It doesn't really make a big cut or shelf on the treble frequencies. This is just like, it's still the same volume, but really mid-heavy. It's still the same volume, but scooped out. So this is a really powerful control to kind of change around between album sounds, and especially depending on your mic and cab setup. And then gain is about 1 o'clock, 1:30. I tend to keep it no more than that because after that it does get mushy, and you definitely want to stay articulate with this kind of metal sound. That brings us to the cabinet section, which is oftentimes one of the most important ingredients to a guitar sound, and in this case it is very crucial because for all 3 albums they were using a 1960 Marshall 4x12 with T75 speakers. It was like the JCM 900 style cabinet. And for my equivalent or replacement of that, I got the 2x12 Little Brother with the 1936, still T75 speakers. I won't be getting the full 4x12 thump nor the direction that you would get from like their angled cabinets they were using, but by the time you mic this up, it still sounds more or less the same, especially since it has the classic English birch plywood construction. I love this cabinet. So if you're looking for this kind of sound without wanting to break your back, definitely a high recommendation from me. Last but not least, we have the microphone, starting with, of course, the Shure SM57, because this is a high gain metal tone. So of course we're using an SM57, but this was the primary mic on both None and Destroy, Erase, Improve. And it certainly sounds like it because it has that iconic chuck of SM57 up to the cone edge and call it a day, but it sounds good, so really no more need for that. From what I can gather, that's it. Those were the only mics used on there. I personally blend in some other stuff for my own tones, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Things get really interesting with Chaosphere though, because they blend some guitar tones with this, but the primary mic was something that looked very similar to this. Friedrich bought a TLM 193 from Neumann, and that is a very even-tempered vocal microphone. It still does the condenser mic thing, but it doesn't have quite as much high-end presence as some of their other vocal microphones would. And when stuck up to a guitar cabinet, it has a very raunchy, low, heavy sound that has worked perfectly for this album and is half the reason that it has that the tonal quality that it does. For my substitute, I have this Cam Crystal, and this is pretty much a clone of the TLM 103, which in and of itself is very close to the 193, except it has a bit more of that high-end sparkle you might expect from a vocal condenser mic. So you are going to get a bit more presence boost from this thing, but you can easily counter that with some EQ in post or simply move it around a bit more on the guitar speaker. But this still does like that same raunchy scooped out frequency and the, like the 700, 1000 hertz regions. And I love the sound of this thing. I used it last time for cleans. One of my favorites. I'm going to use it again for high gains, and I'm going to keep using it again because for like the less than $80 I paid for this, pretty good stand-in. In terms of positioning, all picture and video evidence would suggest that Friedrich tends to stick on the edge of the dust cap, putting the SM57 more or less perpendicular right on the line, where his Neumann will be kind of on the edge. So if this was like the circle perimeter, it would be more or less right here. I changed distances and kind of tweaked the position as well. And I actually ended up using both microphones for all 3 album tones, and I just mixed them accordingly. And again, kind of played with them between each take. But that's something you're probably going to have to do by ear as well, because I've got a different cabinet, you'll likely have a different cabinet, likely have different microphones. And if you're doing this in the real world, all those things are going to change. But it's a good guideline. It's a good position anyway for metal, and especially if you want to start tweaking with 45 degrees and all that stuff, you can get some different sounds. So most of these you're hearing is this being the dominant microphone by like 9 decibels or more. And then for the Chaosphere stuff, this becomes the dominant microphone. And then of course we'll have our EQ tone match impulse responses as well of each of those captures. Before I show the final results of these tonal configurations, I thought I'd give you an idea of some of the differences you can expect between something like this 33, which has a baked-in EQ curve, and something a little more modular like the Boss GE7. So I'll flip between those pedals a few times. The other thing I'm using is this Fortenzold noise gate. That's something that wasn't explicitly listed in, their gear. It definitely helps for recording and for live playback. I've got that in the effects loop, which if you're using an older, rectifier, you're going to need to mod to make it work because they're not series effects loop stock. You got a newer one, it's all good. And then I'm using this Roach splitter to use the key input and get another signal going here. This is one of those things where the signal chain is way simpler than it actually looks. This is in the loop. I'm just splitting a clean signal to here, and then this is all going to the front. With the cabinet sound, I'm going to be recording this through the line out. So I'm going to be playing through this cab. It's still going to react the same way, but I'll be switching between a couple different impulse responses, some of which I've made with those microphones and, or my custom mix to more or less sound like the album. Then I'll compare those to the EQ match versions of those same IRs to fall more in line with the album sound. For reference, this is what to expect without a boost. Still not terrible, but does not have that low-end articulation. But not to say that can't work, so, like some of the lower gain solos actually sound okay with that. So stuff like that may not necessarily have to have the boost. And I know we're covering rhythm stuff primarily here, but if you want the clean sound, then that rectifier clean channel pretty much works the same way. And that's pretty much it for the tangible gear. The rest is in your hands as far as the riffage is concerned. So with that, let's hear all the other sound snippets for the real amplifiers. For those of you that would like to achieve these tones on your Fractal audio device or even on free VST plugins, check the links in the description below. I've got you covered. So I've made presets for the AX8, AXFX2, and of course the AXFX3 that will cover all three of these album tones. You will have to download the cabinet impulse response separately and load it into your own user files and then choose that. Obviously with the AX8, I'm not able to do tone matches natively, but that is the workaround. And then for free VST plugins, we'll be using the Poolin Legion for the Nun sound and the Poolin Lecto, which is of course a rectifier sim for Destroy, Erase, Improve and Chaos Sphere using a EQ as the pre-section boost. Also revisiting the Ignite Amps TPA1 for a more pronounced power section, and then of course the classic NAT IR to load the cab impulse responses. So I'd say that about does it for this tone engineer, and I gotta say I am stoked about the results of this one. Even playing through the VST plugins to the album, center panned, just it blended great. It was so immersive, especially when you throw on some stereo effects or playing through the AX8 with the enhancer, or especially this through microphones and good set of headphones. And in the room, all that, just some of the best metal tones ever, in my opinion. I love this setup, and I'd love to revisit this at some point if I ever can justify and come across that holy grail rectifier and the TC preamp, and especially in Ibanez Universe. But I think for most bedroom or office enthusiasts, this is going to be a great setup, especially for the digital stuff. So I think that's it. If you have any other suggestions you'd like to see, do let me know. I plan on putting out a poll in the next few days that will ask what you guys would like to see out of the ideas that I have, and I look forward to getting onto our next genre-specific edition of Tone Engineer. So thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Any questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. We'll see you next time. Bye.